On page 292, the text begins to describe the constraint-based approach, which is the main competitor of the garden path theory. This approach to understanding ambiguity is an interactive approach rather than a modular approach, and as such, it allows for feed down from the top to occur and influence our early processing or our first pass-through of understanding a sentence. The garden path model necessarily holds, or the garden path theory, I should say, necessarily holds that any sentences that are formed in a dispreferred way would be difficult to understand. But what we really see is that some are more difficult to understand than others. Here on the bottom of page 292, we see two examples of sentences. The first one is, "The dog walked to the park, wagged its tail happily." Now, that doesn't seem to make sense on first pass because we assume that the dog is doing the walking autonomously, that it's doing it itself. But what the sentence means to say is the dog was being walked, right? So the dog being walked to the park wagged its tail happily. But the word being was removed because it's a reduced relative clause, or we could say the dog who was, or the dog that was being walked. So because it's a reduced relative clause, it's difficult to understand. The second sentence, "The treasure buried in the sand was never found." That's not a difficult sentence to understand, but according to the garden path theory, it should be as difficult to understand as the first sentence, because this is also a reduced relative clause. The treasure that was buried in the sand was never found would be the version of the sentence that had a full relative clause, that was not reduced. If we were to process the second sentence according to the garden path theory, essentially we would be processing it on our first pass as if the treasure was doing the burying. The treasure buried, as if the treasure was an autonomous animate entity that could bury something. And then we would say the treasure buried in the sand, and we would begin to wonder, we would expect at that point for it to have buried in the sand something. The treasure buried in the sand a dog, or I don't know, what do you bury? I guess you could bury a stick, right? The treasure buried in the sand, a stick. That's what we would expect, and we would get to the phrase "was never found," and we would wonder what was going on. But in fact, we process "the treasure buried in the sand was never found" as a reduced relative clause without any difficulty whatsoever, suggesting that the garden path theory can't really be correct.